Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this new edition of European Politics in Transition, a series organized by SPUI 25 and ACES, Amsterdam Center for European Studies. Today we're going to talk about the US presidential elections and the implications they have for Europe. And it's been quite a ride these past few days, weeks, months, and maybe even years. And we are all in confusion about what's to come. So there's a lot to discuss, and we're going to do that with three scholars and a journalist. And we had initially invited also a second journalist, Laila Frank, but she's not here because she's at the NOS giving live feedback on what's happening in the US. So we'll be missing her, but we've got four excellent experts here left for you. My name is Lisa Peters, and I'll be moderating today's session. And I want you to know that if there's any breaking news, we will certainly let you know, so you can put your phone away and just surrender to this session. And we will keep you posted. Before I'm going to introduce our guests, I would like to ask you, dear viewer, how are you doing? How are you feeling? Could you give a response in the poll that you are now seeing? How are you feeling? Are you happy, sad, relieved, anxious, confused, angry, or at least three of the above? I mean, it's been it's a confusing time for some, and some may be relieved that there's coming an end to an era, maybe, or maybe you're going into another 4 years of Trump. So how do you feel? Let us know. And if there's been enough votes, we're going to see the results. And I'm curious to find out how you are doing. Let's see. Most of you are confused and anxious, and at least three of the above. I mean, I can imagine, and I'm very curious to find out which combinations you have, but I'm not in the position to ask. Another question for you. Who do you expect to be president on the 21st of January, 2021? Because we don't know who has won the elections yet. And there's a lot that can happen still. Recounts, not all states have been called for. So what do you expect to be the president? Who do you expect to be the president for the coming 4 years? Is that Joe Biden or again, Donald Trump? What do you think? Let's see. As people were anxious and confused, I can imagine that you are hoping for one of the candidates, but I don't know what you're expecting. Let's see. What are the results of this poll? Most of you are expecting Biden to be the next president. Well, let's see what our panelists think about that in a moment. Each panelist is going to make an opening statement about, their view on what's happening in the US and what is the consequence for Europe. And we've asked them all to prepare a sort of a relay question. So they'll pose a question to the one who's up next. And we're going to start with Cas Mudde. He's a professor at the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. And Cas, you can open your mic. And I'm going to ask you a very short question. How are things in Georgia now?
Well, they're confused. And so I got a question earlier today from a European journalist asking me what's the mood in the street, which is a very European question because we don't have streets here. We only drive through streets. But to be authentic, I actually
the mall, then.
well, the mall is a sad thing in my town, but I drove through town and there's nothing. It's a ghost town. Most universities, it's a university town, so most students are not there. There were no new flags. Everyone is waiting, and I think that's the mood of the country as a whole. And I think it's also important to reflect on what hasn't happened over the last few days. Actually, election day was completely uneventful, despite weeks of fear mongering about like civil war and whatever. Since then, like while those 100 people in Phoenix, Arizona are on TV 24/7, like it's a metropolitan area of many millions of people, and there are 100 in the street. So I think that's important to know. I mean, while everything can still happen, there's actually a lot not happening. I think slowly but steadily, everyone is starting to accept a Biden win, which could be horrible if that doesn't happen. But one of the most remarkable things for me is how absolutely no one backs up Trump at the moment. No high-ranking Republicans, only washed-out people like Newt Gingrich. No European leaders except of Janša in Slovenia. Not even Fox News, who has now become the enemy because they called Arizona earlier than others, right? And so you kind of feel Trump tweeting from the White House, like it reminds you of the bunker scenes of Hitler, like shouting in a void. And I think that's important. But the key thing here is this is, to a certain extent, the worst outcome that could have happened. If Biden becomes the president, he will be the even weaker than Obama was from the start. McConnell has already said that he is going to pretty much block him, get any type of progressives in his cabinet. And if Trump would still win, he is going to unleash just a torrent towards anyone who hasn't supported him over the last couple of days. So I'm like, in the end, the only thing that Biden needed to do was get Trump out. Like, I'm progressive, and so I have not too much expectations of Biden, but he was there to get Trump out so that the Democratic erosion would stop for at least 4 years. That is what he's going to do. I worry that he won't do much more. I have a question for Sarah, right?
Yes, that's good that you're mentioning Sarah, and she is Sarah Polak. She is an assistant professor in American Studies at the University of Leiden, at the Center for the Arts in Society. So do tell us your question.
So, Sarah, you have been looking at the COVID narrative in the US. In what way do you think COVID has played a role in this election?
Thank you very much, Gus. Yeah, I think COVID has played, on the one hand, it has played a big role, of course, in the narrative. I think of this election, it has been like the massive wild card, really. And so and slightly broader, perhaps the health and so on of the candidates has been a massive issue, of course. Has COVID been good or bad for Trump? I think it's kind of a difficult question to ask. I'm quite surprised at how many people voted for Trump after the way he handled COVID. But and on the other hand, I think there is kind of the way that he was spinning it, especially, of course, when he himself became ill, was vintage Trump in a way that, I guess worked. I've said in previous contexts that actually your own health as a president is one of the very few things that it's completely the norm to lie about. And so his kind of playing of that, and his like having his doctor also act as a spin doctor in that sense, is very normal, actually, in like historically speaking. And what struck me was the way that he, played with the idea of coming back in a Superman suit, because I think that really kind of fits with the way that Trump sort of presents himself as a kind of cartoon character, and that tends to work very well for him and tends to, bring in meme responses and so on, that, he has a kind of contact with his supporters that is much more like a form of fandom than, other sort of traditional ways of interacting with a constituency. So I think that's, I thought that was very interesting to see that he wanted to come back in a Superman suit. And also then there were a couple of memes that struck me particularly. For instance, the I don't know if you can probably Google it quickly if you want to, but it's a tweet, and the meme is Biden sort of photoshopped into an old people's home, and it says Biden for resident rather than president, of course. And I think that's one of those things that Trump seemed very sort of vindictive and happy about in his kind of like classic cartoon style. And on the other hand, of course, if you think about this in terms of, what was wise electorally speaking, that was probably no good for him at all, especially if you look at sort of early outcomes based on exit polls. It seems like older people have voted much, much less for Trump than they've done before. And I think this may have played a role in that. Yeah, other than that, I also have a question for Casper. So maybe Lisa, you want to introduce Casper?
Yes, if you've finished your opening statement, that is.
Sure. Okay. I'd like to keep it short.
Yeah, we also have Casper Thomas here. He's a journalist, Washington-based, and he writes for the Financiële Dagblad and the Groene Amsterdammer, both Dutch magazines, daily and weekly. And Sarah, what's your question for him?
So Casper, one of the focus points of my research recently have been what I've called Trump's cartoon politics, or his cartoon logic. So this way that he kind of really acts as a cartoon character. And then people, of course, always ask about that. Do you see that elsewhere too? Is someone like Bolsonaro or Thierry Baudet in the Netherlands or Boris Johnson, is he also this kind like a politician that acts according to a cartoon logic? And I always think that is the case to some extent, but the sort of aesthetic is different, right? For Baudet, for instance, it revolves more around concert pianos and lavender bags and so on. It's a different type of cartoonishness, perhaps. And so I was reading your great article in the Groene Amsterdammer about Trumpism as kind of this idea that America is a company rather than a nation state in a traditional sense. And I was wondering how you see that similar effects play out in Europe, or whether you do that, or whether this is something that we should look out for in the future.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and very happy to be here. It's a great question, and I'll start off first with the Trump as a cartoon or maybe a movie character. And just before Election Day, I was, for my final travel through the US up until Election Day, I was in Houston, Texas, to interview voters, and I was at the parking lot of a local high school. And on that parking lot, there were two groups assembled. There was the Biden bus was coming by with some Democratic representatives to speak to the Democratic voters present there. It was at the polling booth also. And all of a sudden, there was this whole line of SUVs and pickups with Trump flags and music coming onto the parking lot, and they were organizing a counter rally. So you had these two groups. It was a political edition of the West Side Story in a way. The two groups opposed on the parking lot of a high school, and one of the members of the Trump group there was carrying a big banner He was a Mexican-American man, and the banner said Mexicans for Trump, and it had the head of Trump superimposed on what seemed like an image of a Mexico City gang. They were all carrying guns, and in the middle there was Trump. So I think that speaks to what you're talking about, that he is in a way perceived by parts of the electorate as some kind of fictional hero in a drama, and many tropes of violence also that are sort of woven into this. And I think that speaks to a broader point about maybe American politics in general, but especially about this election revolving around whether Trump will get a second term or not. Is the narrative seems so much more important than any factual issues on the ground. Like I had to really look for plans, ideas, opposing viewpoints that go behind the fact that there's just two characters battling each other out, and that has really been on the back burner. Also, I think in many of minds of the voters. So you see the fictional element of politics, or the narrative element, or the spectacular element, the dramatic element, you could say. You see that really taking over. And then you ask me, to what extent is there maybe a bridge from this to Europe? I like to think, but maybe I'm wrong there, that Europe is slightly less prone to the dramatization and fictionalization of politics than the US. What does help in many ways that if you compare it to, say, to a screen, it is easier to watch two characters. If you have to watch a election where there's many parties competing, it is just a more fractured image. So the system just lends itself less well for that kind of politics. But nevertheless, you can easily see ideas and type of styles that Trump has done over the few years being imported into Europe. And that really brings me to the essence of what I think this election, at least from the perspective of a reporter, is about. To one extent, it was the question, has Trump been an aberration? Was it just sort of an electoral accident of history, and will it be put to an end after 4 years? Or is it something of a new normal? And given the still overwhelming support for Trump that he gets during this election, regardless of who's going to be the president, shows that we cannot simply discard the effectiveness of this kind of politics, as worrying as it is. And that brings me to the second essence, and that is, what does it say about the United States? That is sort of the general question you have as a reporter behind each article. And there I'm struggling a bit with how to interpret everything so far, and also on the way ahead. Because if you think of it, over the past 4 years, we've basically equated the United States with Trump. Every article was about Trump. All the coverage was about Trump. There was Trump before an end. But then, given the fact that Trump 4 years squeezed by as a winner, he only barely won the presidential elections. It was a very small basis to build a very big story on. So if we're consistent and say Mr. Biden becomes the president with a very small number of votes, we should do nothing but talk about how, I don't know, middle of the road liberal the United States is, because the president squeezed by with 100,000 votes. But you can already sense in my voice that is probably not going to happen. We'll still be talking about Trump. So I'm still to figure out how we should deal with this, and that is something also maybe we can be talking about. And that brings me to my question for Penny. So Lisa, maybe.
Penny Sheets, that's our fourth and final panelist today. And she works at the Department of Communication at the University of Amsterdam. And Casper, do tell us, what do you want to know from Penny?
Well, what I want to know, and this sort of bridges from Sarah also with Penny, you're an expert in also in political communication. What I actually wanted to ask you is, to what extent do you think the Democrats and Biden have run an effective campaign when it comes to presenting themselves and trying to tell a story, which is obviously so important here in American politics?
That's a great question. And I think, I've been thinking a lot about this lately too. And if you'd asked me maybe 2 months ago, I would have thought not well, because it's very hard, as has been hard for now quite a number of elections, to see clearly what the Democratic platform is, what they stand for. They're not nearly as coherent on messaging as the Republicans tend to be. That said, I think over the last few weeks, we've seen it emerge quite clearly that Biden, in and of himself, sort of embodies the perfect antidote to Trump right now. I think he's not so polarizing, right? Certainly nothing like we saw 4 years ago with Clinton. He's not so polarizing. He's just kind of his normal old self. And that seems to be, at least in the run up to the ambiguous results, what people wanted. They wanted something that was not Trump, but not polarizing and maybe rational, maybe he can be bipartisan, et cetera. So to the extent that he has done that deliberately, I think it's been quite smart. I'm also interested recently, I have this impression that, it has been much less about Biden. So I agree with the caricature of the election as these two cartoon characters fighting it out, but it seems as though he and Harris have both kind of retreated from the very hyper-personalized attention. I don't know if that's deliberate or just a media dynamic, but I think that that's been effective at wooing a lot of Democratic and potentially moderate voters who don't want a polarizing figure there. They just want something other than Trump. So I don't know if that, we'll continue to discuss that. I also wanted to say, in sort of thinking about how to start my little opening statement, is that I've been thinking a lot about and engaging with other speakers in various events, this idea that, for a long time, America was sort of considered a model of democracy for the world. And obviously, if nothing else, the outcome of this election, and I think 4 years ago, and the 4 years under Trump, has obviously tarnished that model image. It was arguably already tarnished before that, but it's very clear now, abundantly clear to people both in the States and abroad, that the model of democracy is very dysfunctional in the US. And so you see this, I get to see this when I'm teaching students courses about the US here, and there are sort of incredulous faces when I try to explain how the Electoral College works, or why I can't answer the question, who will finally make the final call in the election, right? These are two sort of legally complicated questions to handle. And it's also a question I see surfacing in media coverage of the elections, right? Is this the American model idea really crumbling? I think that there are big policy consequences for that crumbling image. Also internationally, that's not my expertise, but I think that there are big implications that because that is failing and America is retreating from its role internationally and as a multilateral partner, those effects have already been felt here, and I'm sure will continue to be felt should Trump be reelected. I do think that, if Biden gets into office and if there is a massive shift in sort of how the elected politicians do their jobs, as in they actually represent their entire constituencies and not only those that are their partisan supporters, there's the potential for, a Biden administration to pull America back from the brink. I think it's on the brink of something catastrophic, honestly. And I think that it particularly has to do with this polarization that's come up also in the previous statements that we've heard. The fact that so many people can vote for these two very different versions of the world and America is a system that no longer can be accommodated by our two-party system in particular. This winner takes all is obviously dysfunctional. So I think that extremism and the polarization isn't isolated to America. I think it's related to the extremism and some of the movements we see rising here in Europe, right? In Europe, excuse me. I think there's the sentiments and complexities of globalization are felt worldwide. But if America can get this right and pull back from the brink and actually genuinely work at repairing itself in some way, then potentially the consequences won't be quite so devastating going forward. That's how I wanted to open it, which is a little bit devastating and like sensational myself, I guess. But that the polarization is really the fundamental thing for me that I've taken away from these elections.
Well, I guess that's a nice bridge to your question to Cas.
It is. Cas, I need you as someone who, by the way, whose literature is cited in nearly all of my students' papers all the time. So it's a delight to get to pose a question to you. Do you think that there's a future for the US system where the two parties could evolve into a multi-party system? Not maybe our 11 or 12 represented parties here in the Netherlands, but maybe we have the kind of more populist wing of the the Republican Party breaking off from the sort of Lincoln Project folks now, maybe the more green leftist version of the Democrats versus the centrist. Do you think there's a way that that could evolve that doesn't require, you know, some of the complex constitutional changes that we would love to have happen to the Electoral College?
That's a very good question, and it is important to realize that the institutional structure is almost certainly not going to be changed, because constitutional changes are phenomenally difficult. On top of that, weirdly, the electoral system is decided at the state level in many ways, and so there's not so much that you can do at the federal level. Now, the thing that I kind of disagree with is that this is something new. Like, I live in the state of Georgia, which until roughly the 70s, late 70s, had a Democratic Party that was completely different from the Democratic Party in Pennsylvania, right? I mean, the so-called Dixiecrats were a deeply racist party, in a sense, the classic far-right party, like racist yet socioeconomically kind of in the middle, and welfare chauvinist to a certain extent. That has existed pretty much since the end of the Civil War. And at the same time, the Republican Party has always had two different camps. It had kind of the coastal Republicans, which was like big money kind of Republicans, and it had the heartland religious Republican Party. So the fact that you have four parties in two parties, like because of the electoral system, I think isn't new. Depending on the role that Trump is going to play, should he not become president, we're going to see that. Like, I mean, first of all, clearly the struggle within the Democratic Party hasn't been decided. To put it mildly, the Sanders supporters are not impressed by what Biden has achieved, and obviously they already knew that Bernie would have won much bigger. There's no evidence for that claim, but this is what they have always claimed and would have claimed even if Biden would have won like whatever 70% of the vote. At the same time, the Republican Party has become the party of Trump over the last 4 years, but not necessarily through embrace, but more by stepping back. And you saw that very well at the Republican National Convention, where pretty much like, except of Trump and Trump's family and some real kind of sycophants, there were very few prominent Republicans. Not only because they weren't invited, because they didn't want to be there. This was the election of Trump, and if he wins, so be it, it will work with him. If he loses, they can like detach from him and say, well, like he was just over the top, right? But like we have a good thing going here. And in that sense, I'm actually even wondering whether Mitch McConnell isn't happy with what is going to pan out now. I mean, they have completely deregulated the state. They have defunded almost all important organizations. With the Republicans in control of the Senate, Biden can do very, very little. And Mitch McConnell doesn't want to radicalize. He wants to stabilize. And he cannot do that with Trump. So the question really in the coming years is going to be, I think, a polarization within parties rather than between parties. And that has a lot to do, of course, with social media and with broader media context. I mean, talk radio and Fox News have created this beast that is far bigger than many people understand. Like, I mean, I lived in Indiana for a while. If you drive 3 hours, within half an hour of leaving your town, the only channels that you can hear are talk radio and religious radio. Right? And so it's not just Fox News, it's much bigger. And you see now on the left also this whole like explosion of very radical podcasts in particular, and some radio programs, TV programs, which are very rich, and magazines like Jacobin, which are almost more against Biden than they are against the Republicans. And so I think that's where it's going to play out in the coming years.
Well, thank you all. There's a lot to discuss, and I think my role will be to make sure that each of you gets enough speaking time. And there are already questions from the audience, and I would like to start with them. And I want to address the audience. If you have any more questions, put them up into the Q&A, and also the YouTube live stream. We are following the timeline there, so we can also pose your questions to the panelists here. And one of the questions that came from, let's see, Bilo Withers: what does the constant accusations done by Trump of so-called fraud and the threats of lawsuits and recounts do with the democratic processes in the broader sense, and with the Trump base specifically, as there's a great shift from red states to blue? Who would like to respond to that first?
I can respond.
Yes, sure.
It's actually one of the things hopeful and encouraging.
Wait a minute, Sarah, could you start once again, because the sound was a bit off.
Okay. Oh, sorry. Is it okay now?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So one thing that I found actually encouraging in the last couple of days is that, you know, this doesn't seem to be doing so much. Actually, you know, throughout, I guess, the last 4 years, it's always been the question, you know, does the system hold up to Trump? Does the process still work? And how important is it that, you know, he violates all of those norms? Like, you know, in the speech that on the night of the 3rd, that he said, you know, I've basically already won. That, as he had announced he would, you know, do. And everybody was like, also including a lot of Republicans, were like, this is really going too far. He shouldn't do this. Americans want all votes to be counted. And so I think that in a way, Trump was, of course, as president, often given permission to kind of far right undercurrents in the US that, as Gasse said, have always been there, but have rarely been kind of represented in the White House at this kind of level. And at the same time, I've noticed that, you know, not so much is happening. There aren't riots all over the place. A lot of people seem to realize that all of the lawsuits that he's starting, you know, he has a right to do that perhaps, but it's very unlikely that a recount is going to actually swing the vote in states like Wisconsin.
Casper, you are in Washington D.C. How do you feel about this?
Well, I was thinking that the issue here, I think, is regardless of the outcome. So, in a scenario in which Trump loses this election and doesn't become president, the very fact that he's been delegitimizing the electoral process for weeks, even heading up to the election, has been saying the only way I can ever not be president for the next 4 years if the Democrats steal the election. And I think he has left something left behind, which will be believed by many of his supporters for basically up until eternity, but at least for the coming 4 years. If you think there's still, I think, about 25% of the population in the US, I should look up the exact figure, but I believe it's somewhere around this, that still believes that the Obama presidency was illegitimate because Obama, and there's obviously no truth to this, but it was born out, could not be a president, which is a theory Trump used to launch his first campaign with. So if that lingers for so long, imagine thinking how long the idea among Trump supporters will linger that the election results will be illegitimate. So apart from the deadlock that might be appearing in Washington between a Democratic president and a Republican-held Senate, I think the whole idea of a legitimate government as a whole has already been spoiled and poisoned by the way Trump is conducting himself now.
Can I just add the historical context here? I mean, since 2000, pretty much, we haven't had a president that was considered legitimate by the vast majority. Like the many Democrats didn't consider George Bush legitimate because of like the elections being decided in court. Obama clearly wasn't considered legitimate by a sizable portion of the right. And then Trump wasn't considered legitimate by a sizable portion of the Democrats. The point, though, is, and I think we forget this because we all undoubtedly live on social media, I think a lot of these things mean very little. Like, it's not because people tweet "not my president," like that they behave really much different than they would behave to a president of a different party. Right? I think we make a lot of really strong statements that are nothing beyond that empty statement. Now, I'm not saying it's a good thing, right? But in a system that is polarized, and sure, it has become more polarized, but like in that sense, Trump is a catalyst rather than a cause. The process has been going on for a long time, and irrespective of who would become the next president, right? Either whether it was Biden or Trump, he would not be considered legitimate by a sizable portion of supporters of the other party. What does that do to the belief in the system? It's not good. But you can see it in a different way too. When I came here about 12 years ago, I was struck by how naive Americans are about their system. I mean, first of all, they obviously don't understand the intricacies of the system. But I mean, they hold the Constitution up as this like unique document, which has like very much written by Jesus himself.
It's sacred.
And they talk about the system in detail as bad, but as overall as very good. And I think it's good for Americans to actually look more critical at the system. Of course, not in this purely polarized way, but I wonder whether that has to continue. Like, I mean, there's also a generational element there. So on the one hand, it's worse because this is a longer process. On the other hand, I also think this is a generation to a certain, this is a time where social media has transformed the population. In 20, 30 years, the majority of the population has always lived with it. And I think that will also have a consequence, and it doesn't have to be worse.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to pose another question that comes from Jonathan Zeitlin. And he says, the subtitle of today's event focuses on the implications of the US elections for Europe. And Penny touched briefly on this. I've been seen it suggested in a press commentary that foreign policy might be one of the few areas where Biden might be able to make a difference. Without Trump, many Senate Republicans might prefer a less pro-Putin and more pro-NATO and even pro-EU approach, which Biden could conceivably work with to some extent. What do you think about this? And that's a very good question because we've got to keep on topic today. So before we go into the social media usage of future in the future, we'll discuss this. Penny, do you want to say something about this first?
Sure, I'll start. I don't claim to be a policy expert, but I do think indeed that this notion of multilateralism is a huge problem in that Trump has more clearly abandoned this compared to previous presidents that I've lived through, let's say. So I think that that is one of the biggest areas for potential for Biden if he does take office. Certainly to come back more forcefully in support of NATO, to rejoin the Paris Climate Accord that we officially left today or yesterday, I can't remember, and to support, I think, the European Union. I think that the European Union as as a phenomenon is more in danger from the forces fighting it under a Trump administration than under a non-Trump administration, and certainly a Biden administration. So I do think that those ramifications could be felt here. Maybe I'm overly simplistic in that, but I think that there are wider reaching consequences because Trump, just like many of his supporters and many Americans, the same ones that Koss met when he moved there, we focus on America first, right? And it's partly because it feels really far away if you don't travel that much and you don't grow up with a family that travels to other countries. You just don't really pay that much attention. You pay attention if you know someone who's in the military, then that person has to go fight a war. But otherwise, foreign policy is really not top of mind for a vast majority of Americans. So I think it's important to have leadership that does realize its importance and cooperates.
Gus, I see you want to respond. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I agree. And like just in terms of going back to normal, with regard of going back into the Paris Accords, committing fully to NATO again, becoming more active in the WTO, all those kind of things, right? Clearly, Biden is going to do that. He's going to be trusted, and there is more than enough support in Congress for this, and always has been. At the same time, the US is turning away from Europe. It was already under Obama, and it will continue even more so under Biden or Trump. The Pacific region is far more important to the US at the moment than the Atlantic. And Biden has been incredibly anti-Chinese in his campaign, and actually many Democrats are, even more so than the Republicans. And this has two consequences. First of all, much less attention on Europe, which will create a complete vacuum within the European Union, who have virtually no foreign policy beyond being with the US. And second of all, Europe is going to be squeezed between China and the US increasingly. The US will lean heavily on Europe in terms of its foreign policy. With regard to Iran, they might be closer now, but with regard to Russia and with regard particularly to China, there will be a lot of divisions. Like for all the blustering of the EU, there are a lot of very powerful interests that don't want a real break with Russia, which includes like Germany, but of course also countries like Hungary and others. They have gotten away with this under Trump. Biden might lean much heavier, increase tensions within the EU. But more importantly, and you see that now a bit with the 5G network discussion, like the EU will have to find a way to assert its own position in between the common clash between the US and China, which is a major issue here, and not just from the conservatives, also from progressives.
Do you think, how's Europe going to achieve that? Do you think they're able? Or we are able?
I'm probably the only Eurosceptic here. So I'm very non-impressed by what the EU has been doing for the last 20 years or something. They don't have a foreign policy, and the foreign policy has become even weaker under Trump, because particularly people like Orban has felt covered by frustrating a lot of policies. They can achieve it if they finally start to realize that like their connection or their interests are not always the same as those of the US. But it's going to be hard. And of course, I mean, there are all kind of other problematic issues with the relationships with China. I mean, China is running concentration camps at a scale that we haven't seen like since the Second World War. So being a bit less docile in your relationship would be pretty good for a so-called community of values, right? But at the moment, much of the foreign policy is based on what does the US do and how do we respond to that. And I think that it will be good if the EU is finally starting to think, what do we want?
Okay, news update. The margin in votes is 14,000 in Georgia, and Trump's petition on counting the late ballots has been denied. So everyone is up to speed now again. And I will continue with another question on Europe, and that comes from Noon Abdul Kadir. I hope I pronounce your name correctly. With Fox News fanning the flames of polarization and then somewhat clashing with Trump this election. Wow, it just flips. Where are you? Ah, there you are. I'm sorry, I'm going to start again. With Fox News fanning the flames of polarization and then somewhat clashing with Trump this election, practically distancing themselves from him, what does that say about the state of US media trust, and the spillover of similar strategies into European and global media? Penny, maybe you want to say something about that, or Casper?
Sure. I can maybe start and then Casper can speak, I'm sure, informedly about that. I do think Trump has put the US media in a very different position than any recent president by actively attacking most media sources and denying their credibility left and right. So I think we've seen a mobilization among most media sources and a license, kind of a more free license to be more critical of him than we used to have under the sort of model of objectivity. The fact that Fox has also demonstrated itself in a few instances, including with Chris Wallace as the debate moderator, there's a distinction between Fox News itself and then all the Fox opinion shows. So I think I was just listening to another scholar, a media scholar, speak about this the other day, but it'll be interesting to see what happens when Trump is eventually out of office, whether it's in a few months or a number of years, how the media then go back to reporting on someone that ostensibly doesn't attack them all the time. So have they forgotten their norms? Will they develop new norms of behavior towards the president? Will that spill over into how, the foreign, as we were saying, Casper, you said this in your opening, there's been so much attention to Trump all the time that Trump is equated with the US and vice versa. And absent him, media here as well in Europe need sort of a new way to report on the States, to remember that it's hopefully not all about Trump, that there's more complexity there, that maybe think more critically about some of the issues we've just been discussing, that the policies there do have big implications for how Europe exists and goes forward.
Casper, go ahead.
Yeah, first, the idea of we've been a bit of a strange time in that sense, I think, in the United States, perhaps, which they're gone through a process of what you could maybe call a sort of narrative centralization, where everything focuses on the presidency and what he does in Washington and where he goes and what he tweets. And for a country which I understood also was very interested in its decentral federalized structure, it seems to have done itself a disservice by wrapping their heads all around basically one inhabitant of one particular building in one particularly, maybe not even very interesting city, as much as I like Washington. So that is hopefully a break from that. That I think that that's actually one of the things I like about Joe Biden, in the sense that he might just be slightly less interesting to write about. So that opens up some space for different narratives. And at the same time, they are there. I was very much struck by what Cas said earlier. If you drive out of Indiana for 3 hours, the only thing you can listen to is local talk radio. One of the things I do if I go somewhere for a report, I listen to the local radio station, because that's where I get my most interesting little bits of information from. During this recent trip in Houston, I was following a particular Indian American candidate who was running for Congress, who was broadcasting his ads on Radio Masala, which is Hindi for spiced. And it was a radio station completely in Hindi and very popular within the community. And that is the information atmosphere a large section of a very big city in the United States lives in, and I think that is also one of the things that, of course, makes it the United States fascinating, also for us to look at, but we tend to overlook all those different pockets of their own people in their own infospheres with their own narratives and their own things going on, because it's been so superseded by everything that's been happening around Trump. So potentially we could see a break away from that. And like I say, I personally would welcome it in many ways.
Sarah, you also want to say something about this, I guess.
Yeah, I think that, while I think that what both of you have said is really true, and there is maybe a kind of return to previous norms, I think that, really one of Trump's successes, even though he always says he hates the media and the media are fake and whatever, is that he has a really symbiotic relationship with it. That he is, of course, the thing Trump is really extremely good at is carrying a reality show, and that's kind of what he's been doing all the time. That we already talked about this at the beginning. And it's almost like you have to, even despite of yourself, have to look at it all the time. And I think that's something that we've seen very much in all kinds of media, also internationally. Trump, a black man gets shot in the back in Kenosha, and the discourse is all about racism and police violence, and Trump then says, I'm going to go to Kenosha. Everybody says, please don't. But what happens is that all over the world, the conversation is about Trump again. And that's, and I, as a kind of like Americanist, have to decide, do I want to comment on the radio about Trump going to Kenosha, rather than about the kinds of things that I think the discussion should really be about. So I think that, and of course, a lot of those media also really need attention in a way. And I'm hesitant to say that they decide on their reporting based on clicks and advertising income, because I don't think that's exactly true either. But I think there's a kind of perhaps Twitter depends as much on Trump as vice versa. And I think that like on a slightly more abstract level, of course, we're kind of used still, and I think many journalists are used still, to a sort of loop where a politician says something and the media critically report that to a large audience, and that those citizens then base their vote on their voting behavior on that. And social media, and the fact that users of social media are not just consumers, but also producers of media content and spreaders of media content, really kind of overthrows that loop in a way that I think everyone, but certainly also the media in a kind of broad sense, have to kind of learn to come to terms with. And I think actually that by changing their attitude a bit, that's kind of been their first attempt at achieving that. So yeah, and I think we'll have, even if Trump is like disappears altogether, then the similar change in the media ecosystem, that isn't going to go away.
Will Biden be as much of a Twitterer as Trump was?
Of course not. No. But I mean, the same kind of dynamic is going to continue. If Trump is gone, there'll be another Trump-like figure, and in fact, there are many others. Yeah. But I saw that Penny wanted to respond.
Yeah, I see.
I was going to say, I've also heard a not insignificant number of people hypothesize that Trump will start his own kind of media empire, especially now if he's feuding with Murdoch. He's going to have his own little Breitbart special thing and remain a loud voice in politics. So yeah, it'll be a good reckoning for the news media to try to not be drawn in. They've tried to not fall into these errors that we saw in 2016 on reporting the elections. We could discuss whether or not that's come true. I also think that it's an important moment, the fact that Facebook and Twitter have tried to intervene with misinformation in particular. I think it'll be interesting to see if that comes out in subsequent elections here in Europe, when there's the risk of that. We saw this narrative after Brexit of how much a role misinformation or hyper-personalized versions of that campaign might have influenced the results. So it'll be interesting to see also these global players that are based in the States have to comport with European data laws but obviously play a big role in the political environment here in Europe too. How has this created a lasting impact in their behavior potentially?
Yeah. Gus, did you also want to say something, add to this, or I'm misunderstood? Okay. Penny, you already mentioned the Paris Climate Agreement. And well, that has definitely a lot of a big impact also on Europe. And well, do you think, or no matter who's going to be president, perhaps we could go over the scenarios. What if it's going to be Biden? What if it's going to be Trump? What is the influence for Europe in relation to the climate crisis that we're all in together now?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. Yeah. The climate is the crisis of our time, right? I mean, there are other hugely pressing issues, obviously, right now for a number of communities, but the climate is the thing that we have to figure out, or literally everything will end. So I don't know how a Trump that ignores it will help solve these issues. And I don't even know that, the Paris Accord doesn't go far enough. Does Biden rejoining it make a demonstrable impact? I don't know, but it certainly is. Every little bit helps, is better than nothing, I guess. But Greta Thunberg would say something different, I'm sure. So I don't know. That's, this is what would keep me up at night if I sat and thought about it every day, which I can't. But I think that the US has to do something. And so even if Joe Biden doesn't go as far as the Green New Deal folks would like him to, he's doing a heck of a lot better than, Trump is. Let's put it that way.
Sarah, can you add to this?
Yeah, no, I think I agree with Benny, and I also think that it was, of course, Trump stepping out of the climate accord was, among other things, a very bad example, or it was a very, in a way, of course, really what the world needs to do is far more rather than less. And so I think that, among other things, an effect of that was that it I think gave other countries kind of an easy excuse not to make a lot of those goals. And if and I do think that the US continues to have a kind of exemplary role there, even if it isn't, the city upon a hill that we all, maybe would like to think, or many Americans would like to think it is. There is a sort of, it sets a norm in many ways. And so I think that Biden, or, the US rejoining and maybe actually holding itself and other countries to that norm, certainly in Europe, would perhaps help, or would help Germany to set more stringent norms elsewhere in Europe. So I think I think it's in that sense absolutely important.
Okay. I'll turn to another question from the audience. Rart van Kollenberg, he says, in my political science class, I was taught, based on the work of Mr. Mudde, about the difference between the radical right and the extreme right. And central to this distinction is the acceptance of the democratic process. Could the actions and tweets of President Trump of the last days be good reason to qualify him as extreme right rather than radical right? I guess, Cas, there's only one who can answer this question.
Yeah. So I actually answered it in the in the chat already, but so I mean, from an academic point of view, the whole classification of people these days has become incredibly difficult, because the difference between conservatism and the radical right has virtually disappeared in various countries. And there we have an increasing number of radical right politicians who openly flirt with extreme right aspects. Think about Bolsonaro, think about Trump, or think about Baudet. Now, yes, but I mean, in the short, yes, but it has been very clear since 2015, when he started his campaign, to now, that Trump is clearly not at heart a Democrat. He has very little respect for any type of limit to his power. He complains endlessly about all of that. And it's very understandable. You have to remember that he has worked in a business that is a complete dictatorship. Like, I mean, real estate in particular is about massive amounts of money, but actually very little people. Like, and in his company, he decided everything. And so it's not a CEO of Shell or something. And so that's what he has done his whole life. So why would you expect that he has a particular affinity, like with a consensual model? However, I think the big difference, his critique so far is not anti-democratic. His critique is this process is not democratic, right? Which is a very classic and tricky kind of discourse of the radical right these days. It's like,
it's similar to it's a fake parliament.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, no, I'm not against the system. The system is not living up to, like, the system is not the system it pretends to be, right? And so this is what Trump is arguing at the moment, not like elections are stupid and I just should be the leader because I'm brilliant. No, his argument is that the democratic process is not really democratic, and that's why I reject it, right? And so at face value, that's not an anti-democratic argument. At the same time, if you don't accept the system, right, then, and we all agree that it is democratic, it's highly problematic. And it's highly problematic from a politician who, of course, has profited from a highly problematic system. After all, he lost the popular vote like massively, yet got elected through this weird loophole of the Electoral College. If you can accept that, and don't have an issue with your legitimacy or with the democratic process, then I don't think you have too much argument in the current election.
I see. Now,
I think sorry.
Yeah,
I think
go ahead.
One interesting aspect to that is the way, the sort of delegitimizing that Trump does is that he seems to, and this is something that I see very widely, especially also in Europe, that he seems to kind of gain a sort of, or project a sort of authenticity through his own, like, supposed unmasking of others. So that's kind of what he constantly does, you know, when he's questioned about, you know, saying things that are demonstrably untrue by, for instance, the media, we will always say, no, you are fake, you're fake yourself. And that act of like pulling off a mask is kind of what he constantly does. And that is part of what makes him come across as authentic. And I think that is actually something that is, you know, that you see elsewhere as well, though, that politicians like, you know, the Dutch, like, this is a fake parliament. That's the same kind of movement that that some politicians make here, like that, which is of course problematic, and at the same time, of course, it's more problematic, as Kasters was saying, because the system actually does have many problems. It is true, and it is not Trump's fault that, you know, the Republican candidate has to have like win the popular vote by about 2 or 3%, or the Democratic candidate has to win the popular vote by 2 or 3 percentage points more to also make it stand a chance at winning the Electoral College. That's really a system flaw.
Right. Another question from the audience. The election outcome shows tremendous polarization and something that won't disappear immediately. And what kinds of policy instruments, is a potential Biden presidency likely to engage with to reduce it? What can they do?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and I'm afraid the answer is to an extent very little. But Biden has the idea that he will be the bridge builder. He says, "I'll maybe have some Republicans of a particular stripe, that is, of course, in my cabinet." But I think, like I say, the long-lasting and very deep-rooted distrust against Washington in general, which, remind you, was one of the reasons Trump got elected in the first place, will still be there. And if you see also the election maps at the moment, the blue metro regions in seas of rural red, I don't see the US coming together over anything anywhere soon. And maybe that's a bit of a pessimistic view. I see individual communities finding their way, but I just don't see an overarching American narrative that fits everybody, which might be, in that sense, which might be a bad thing for the country, but maybe that is not necessarily a bad thing for the world. There's one thing I was thinking. If you're running all the election scenarios, I was just looking up earlier before we started this panel, what happens in the case of a draw, equal number of electoral college votes for both sides, which I think still might be, and it's a very slight possibility, but I think the mathematics could still work out. In which case, I believe the House of Representatives will pick the president, and the Senate will pick the vice president. So maybe that is a way to get some things together here.
I would pick up on that point you made about communities. I think that that's what we also lose sight of. It's interesting as an American to watch the election from here and get to play kind of the outsider while feeling it, with my family and lots of old friends there as an insider. So the narrative from here, of course, and in most of just the major outlets, is this divided America. And I absolutely believe that this polarization, as I said in my opening words, is a huge problem. I don't know exactly how that's going to play out. But at the same time, on the day-to-day base outside the election times, it's about these communities, whether it's the specific ethnic communities that share local radio, like you're talking about in Houston, or just neighbors on streets who maybe don't have to think about politics all the time and therefore don't have to have that identity conflict be so top of mind to them. I keep worrying about my family in Minnesota, with coronavirus and after the George Floyd murder and everything there. And the sense is, for all those divisions that unleashes, it's about Minnesotans and what's happening there. And it's a very divided state as well. Pockets of blue and a whole bunch of red. But I think on the day-to-day lives of most Americans, those divisions that most of us study or work with for a life, our profession, are not top of mind to most Americans. So potentially there's some hope there that, post-election, even regardless the outcome, there can be a little bit of pulling back of how salient those identities are. And we can remember that there's other unifying identities among groups of people, I guess. That's my optimist take.
Are you as optimistic, Gus?
No, I'm not.
Oh, too bad.
So I think that what I always feared about Biden is if he would become president, he would pretty much be drawn into exactly the same presidency as Obama had, wasting massive amounts of time reaching out across the aisle to bring in the Republicans pretty much on the Republican terms. And this is what I fear is going to happen. I mean, Mitch McConnell has already pretty much made this explicit. And Biden is not the type of politician to go against that. And so he is going to try and appease. And as was said before, I mean, he's going to bring in, first of all, Republicans who have no standing within the Republican Party anymore or within the base, like John Kasich in Ohio, for example. And the problem, and we've seen that under Obama, in the current Republican Party, whatever you give, they think they deserve. They don't think that they actually have gotten something. They don't give anything in return except of small things that they would have supported anyway. And because this is not so much the mindset, because I don't think they're so ideological. This is the model, which goes back to Newt Gingrich in 1994 and has been perfected over the last decades. And this is what is now expected by Republican voters, particularly in the primaries. But you see it on the other side as well. Like, that's one of the things about polarization. Polarization is not necessarily ideological. In fact, what we see is that Republicans are opposing things in opposition that they support in government, and the Democrats as well. Polarization is about being against the other. And yes, I mean, at a certain level in very small towns, you can get around that, but I don't even think at towns like mine, let alone in larger entities. I mean, this is something that we just have to go through, and I mean, the youth doesn't solve all the issues, but I do think that this is a bit of a generational aspect. But at this point in time, like, let's face it, Biden was the least threatening Democrat you could come up with. And yet, by running a campaign that the Democrats are going to introduce Marxist socialism, like, Trump almost survives. I mean, that says everything about the mindset of that part, right? And that you don't change that easily.
Okay, thanks. Gijs van der Star is asking, in the case Trump loses, how much of a setback will that prove to be for his little nephews in Europe who take cues from him, like Baudet and Orban? What do you think?
I think that is a very good question. I think one of the main global effects of Trump and Trumpism, if there is such a thing, has been that it's been a lodestar for politicians in many countries. And I don't know the answer. I'm just very curious to see what happens to the discourse in the Netherlands, what happens to the discourse in other European countries if, say, the big right-wing populist is no longer there. And to give you a very specific example from my my practice as a journalist, if I get angry letters from readers, even if it's about something related to the Netherlands, the critique very often runs through Trump. For instance, saying, well, the liberal media did not see Trump coming, so why are you talking about this now? So on dinner tables worldwide, on internet fora worldwide, Trump has become a sort of an argument or a rhetorical weapon to use in any type of discussions. If he loses, we do have to draw the conclusion the American people rejected Trump. I'm very interested to see how those conversations will shift, and what it does if that argument simply just disappears. And frankly, that's also something I'm looking forward to if it happens.
And do you have an expectation?
Well, like I say, I think you have to find new arguments to critique the liberal order. You have to find new arguments to critique the left. So I'll brace myself to hear what they are. Maybe they'll remain the same for a large bit, but at least they're not being backed up by the biggest democracy in the world anymore.
Because you do see that they are doing that at this moment. They are using Trump. I mean, Orban and perhaps Baudet, who's in a different position, of course.
Yeah, but I do think...
And US, they send ambassadors abroad, they install policies. So like there is global reach of whoever is in the White House. It's as simple.
Cas?
Yeah, I think that's the most important thing. I mean, the far right in Europe doesn't need Trump. They never did, and they won't. Like Europe has been voting for far right parties before they even knew that Trump existed, and they will continue to do so. But the US has played a major role as kind of a policeman of the world, and speaking out against human rights abuse. Now, as all lefties, like, I've been criticizing them for that because they've always been opportunistic about it. Like, but at least they did it. Under Trump, they stopped. And that sent very strong signals to people like Orban, to people like Bolsonaro, to people like Modi, to people like Netanyahu, right? That you can do what you want as long as you are nice about Trump. The US won't intervene. And let's face it, the US is the only one who intervenes. The EU has been absolutely like toothless with regard to authoritarians, even within their own organization. Right? But that is the key role for Trump. Trump is not close to anyone, not in the US and not in the world. It took Orban 2.5 years and a replacement of his ambassador to the US to get a visit to Trump. Right? And so there is not that type of network. What is there, and why, and this is why Orban came out for Trump early in 2016 and now again, is that what he calls liberal imperialism, right, which is where the US criticizes countries for human rights abuse, right, that he sees in the Democratic Party and that he worries about. And I think for good reason, because that is where I think Biden will be more active than he would have been if he had not run against someone like Trump. Like Americans see the whole world through America. So Orban is the Hungarian Trump, like Baudet is the Dutch Trump. And so for Biden, like international politics has that domestic politics, and he's not just standing up to Trumpism in the US, he is going to stand up to Trumpism in Brazil, in India, and in Israel. And I think that is the most positive aspect of foreign policy if Biden wins, because the damage that Trump has done by not speaking out rather than by endorsing, because he hasn't endorsed so many people, like that has been huge. And of course it led to normalization. Like if the president of the United States says certain things and then you hear it from your local politician, how can that really be that extreme? Right? And so that symbolic function is going to disappear. And I think that is pretty big.
Yeah, very quick point, and I'll be very short. Joe Biden has promised that within a certain amount of time, if he becomes the president, he'll organize a world conference against illiberalism and kleptocracy. Now, I don't expect too much of these things, but I think such a conference would be a good, at least a good sign, and saying, well, let's as democracies, let's come together and fight back against that what fights against us. So let's just all try and hold Joe Biden to that promise in that sense.
Yeah, it's interesting actually in that respect that, you know, the all those sort of international little Trumps, to see it from an American perspective actually are very kind of internationalist, although of course, you know, their rhetoric and their discourse is mostly very nationalist. And I think that's really also historically interesting, because it's a kind of clear continuity. That's always, you know, eugenicism was a very transatlantic international science that at the same time, you know, tried to improve the sort of national, the national stock or the national gene pool. So I think that, you know, it would be interesting to see a kind of, yeah, like an American initiated response to that, or kind of maybe more agenda setting. Yeah, so yeah, let's try and hold Biden to that. And at the same time, yeah, as you say, Casper, I don't know how much we really expect from that. It would be interesting.
And in the beginning, I think Penny was the first to mention it, but the huge polarization it has taken, well, has been developing in the past few years, and is in as it's extreme maybe now, or maybe it will become even worse. Is that something that that flies over the Atlantic and will land here? And will we have to deal with that in the upcoming elections here in the Netherlands as well? What do you think about that, Penny?
Well, I think, you know, as I said, that there are certain issues that are very polarizing, regardless where you are. And we see, you know, very tense divisions of opinion in Europe on particularly, well, we see it also with how coronavirus is being handled, but you see it with issues of immigration, of course, is sort of the go-to number one thing where we can see very strong divisions, very polarized, I would say, reactions. So I don't think, just as Cas was saying earlier, it's not new here either. And I think that because there's largely multi-party systems, it's insured against the kind of outcome that we're currently seeing in the US. But I certainly don't think that a more polarized America that can't make clear strides towards policy that might intervene in other places that arguably need intervening in, or join and be productive members of multilateral agreements, that will have a trickle-down effect. But I think that the polarization itself is probably already here and has been here for ages anyway. It's just that the governmental system works better as insurance against it.
Interestingly enough, the issue of immigration has been very much absent in especially the last stretch of the campaign, or maybe I've been focusing on the wrong things here and there, but as dominant as it was in 2016 for the Trump election, it was relatively absent this time, which might be a sign of America drawing more inwards in the way it talks. But I still don't have an explanation for that, but I was very much struck by the fact that immigration was not a very big issue in the campaign here.
Yeah, I think that's true, but at the same time, nativism was there. I mean, so the US is an incredibly racialized society. Every issue has a racial dimension. And so what Trump pretty much, which is interesting, he went more to dog whistling rather than his outright racism that he had with regard to like the Mexico not sending its best and the killers and the rapists, right? It was now all about law and order, right? Which sure, I mean, you can see as not being racialized, right? But and I get a lot of his campaign material, right? In the back, when you talk about law and order, it's Antifa, but the pictures are Black people. Black Lives Matter in the American understanding, in the white conservative understanding, like, is law and order is not just about like law and order. It's about a certain order. It's about white supremacy, like not as an ideological project, right? But just about how America is, where everyone should be in its place. Sure, it is multicultural, multiracial, as Americans would say, but we all have our role. Women have their role, right? Shouldn't be too loud because problematic. And minorities have their role. If they subscribe to white supremacy, as women who subscribe to patriarchy, they're very welcome. And both of them played a major role. Like, I mean, but not so openly. Like misogyny is all over Trump every single time. Which journalist does he attack? Almost only female journalists, right? And it's almost always in this like know your place type. And so while it is true that immigration didn't play a role, I still think this campaign was highly racialized.
Absolutely. Also, when the whole discussion of the suburbs, they're coming for your suburbs, that's a very racial argument, racialized argument. And it's to the point where knowing who's saying it, it's less of a dog whistle than a bullhorn. But because it doesn't blatantly say it explicitly, it still has that element of deniability that gives it that dog whistle effect psychologically on voters. And that's, demonstrably in political science, there's strong effects of those kinds of cues on what we say are racially conservative voters. So yeah, Ray, I'm glad that we got to this before the end because it's a huge dynamic in America generally, how racialized our debates and discussion is. And I think it's been very positive that there's more of a national reckoning with that. But we really need to see what Biden, if he gets elected, does with that discussion and the need for systematic reform.
Okay. Caspar, are you talking to us? Yes.
Yeah, sorry, I'm not talking to myself yet. I haven't reached that stage of the sleep deprived post campaign season. But no, I was just the only thing I was thinking, like, to what extent we'll see that Trump's they're coming for the suburb strategy will prove successful. If you look at the electoral map, you see in many ways that it's going to be many of those suburbs that actually will cost Trump the election, maybe even. Those are the counties that we're now looking at, I think, for the final votes coming in. So maybe he has just sort of missed the mark there a little bit.
Well, the cities that we're looking at in particular are Philadelphia, Detroit, and Atlanta, which are African American cities. I mean, that is the only racial group that has very, very overwhelmingly rejected Trump. The data about the suburbs, the white suburbs, so far have been not so convincing. And of course, we have very imperfect data, but this is one of the things that the left is criticizing Biden for. Like I said, well, Biden was always going to deliver this by attracting, I mean, pretty much suburban moms, right? And they argue that this hasn't happened. I mean, I think we can already conclude that it clearly didn't happen to the extent that was expected and that polls showed to be. But that doesn't mean that they didn't help win, right? If you win states by 10,000 votes or something, then every single factor played a role, including everything, right? But I think if it stands, then the one group that clearly delivered were African Americans, and in particular African American women. There's a lot of debate about Hispanics, and we will need far more data to see whether there was actually a trend or whether this has very much to do with the diversity and heterogeneity of that group. And it seems that whites and white men in particular, but also white women, have definitely not turned far from Trump, although allegedly the largest swing was actually among low-educated white men.
David Dirkse says in the Q&A, in the question, it has the question, isn't the main problem in the USA the incredible differences in wealth? Do you?
Yeah,
Well,
it makes you giggle.
Because the main problem is difficult to identify, I think. But yeah, that's also a huge thing. And I think it's, sorry, I don't want to interrupt you, Sada, but
there you go.
Easy also, I've seen a powerful critique of this not long ago about education. It's very easy to be like, I have a super diverse classroom, with students from all ethnic and religious backgrounds, but they're all from wealthy families or families with enough resources, especially in the US, to send yourself. Obviously there are scholarships, but generally education, right, outrageously expensive. So that definitely plays a role in how we talk about diversity. And I think that's obviously driven some dynamics in support for the two parties.
Yeah, no, I wanted to just say that of course, this kind of latches on a bit to the point that particularly the less wealthy white men have turned away to some extent from Trump. Of course, the part of the electorate that he's really retained is rich people, who've also really profited from his presidency. And I do think that, one really important factor actually that also has some explanatory power for the sort of renewed focus on race is in fact the fact that the distribution of wealth and the inequality in terms of income and in terms of the net worth has really grown so much over the last couple of decades. And that's the work mainly of Republican presidents, but I think that really is one of the things that also drives a lot of nativism and so on. And I think that's a Republican would want that frustration to go towards frustration against other ethnic groups. So I think there is a sort of, and I also think that the sort of strangely that really that drives people into the arms of a president who is this kind of daddy figure, like a businessman who will take good care of them, because they've learned to expect nothing from politics, including from presidents like Obama. So yeah, I think it is a very important factor.
Again, exit polls are very problematic at this stage, but one of the things it showed was that the economy was the key issue for Republicans, right? Which then directly leads to this assumption that this is the economic anxiety of the poor whites. But Biden clearly won the under 50,000 and the other 100,000, whereas Trump only won the over 100,000. You can be very rich and very worried about the economy. Like I was driving yesterday behind a brand new BMW 7 Series, which has at its plate lower tax, right? Clearly, he had an issue with how little money he had to buy his $80,000 car. This issue of economic is the thing, so it must be poor people. It's not that easy. It's not to say that it isn't the case. A subset of the electorate of Trump undoubtedly falls within that category. But in 2016, polls showed
Final remark, Cas.
Yeah, that actually economic inequality was a minor issue for Trump voters.
Okay. We've reached 1900, as they would say in the US, I guess, and that means that we are going to round up this panel. And I would like to thank you all, Sarah, Casper, Gus, Benny, and everyone in the audience for joining us today. And at the end of November, there's another edition of the European Politics in Transition series, and you are very welcome to join us then again. And for today, I'm going to close this session, and I'm wishing you all a very